It's Friday. It's that day when Christians throughout the world think about that other day, all those years ago, when on a hillside just outside Jerusalem, a man was cruelly and viciously put to death, along with other men. From a human point of view, it was a miscarriage of justice, it was a tragedy, it was a terrible event, and yet Christians call this day good. And we've always wanted to say that although those other things are true, God was powerfully at work in this particular death. And when Christians have wanted to talk about how that's the case, they've reached for different kinds of language and different images. Some years ago, a good friend, Lucy, came to see me and said, "Steve, I've had an idea in prayer that I'd love to make a big stained glass cross and hang it over the centre of the church worshipping area, so that when people are in church, the cross won't be right in their line of sight, but if they look up, they'll realise that the cross is always central." And she said, "There's one other thing. I want the cross to rotate very slowly, so that if someone looks up at one point, they'll see the cross from one angle, and if they look up a few minutes later, they'll see it from another angle and in a different light." And when Lucy said that, I realised that's really how the New Testament talks about the death of Jesus. The New Testament writers, they reach for different areas of language to describe what it was that God was doing when Jesus hung on that cross. From the language of the law court, they reach for this idea of the fact that we were let free, though we were guilty. Jesus took the legal penalty upon himself. From the temple, they took the idea of sacrifice, that Jesus' death was the perfect sacrifice offered up to God. From the marketplace, they took the idea, having seen slaves bought and sold, that in the cross, God was redeeming us. He was rescuing us from our enslavement to all the things that bind us and releasing us to be his servants, which is perfect freedom. From the battlefield, they took the idea that although Jesus looked to be the loser that day on the cross, in that crucifixion, God was winning a mighty victory. And then there's the language that Paul uses in today's little reading from Romans 5, verses 10 and 11, which is language from the area of personal relationships. For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son. We were reconciled to him. This is the language of personal relationships and relationships between nations, where so often there's discord and there's conflict and there's misunderstanding. I don't know how you're getting on in your household in these times of lockdown, but for some of us, we're perhaps pushed together with people that we do love, but nonetheless, maybe sometimes we rub each other up the wrong way. And Christians believe that in this cross of Jesus, God was, as it were, taking the step. Someone has to take the first step, don't they, when things go wrong? And Paul says here that God, in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, reconciled the world to himself. And of course, in another of Paul's letters, he says, so take that on board. Be reconciled to God. Maybe this is particularly an idea of the cross that's very relevant to us today, where so many people's relationships are broken and there's a lot of conflict and discord. Perhaps it's a particularly important word for us at this time, this language about the cross. Well, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. And Paul goes on to say, if while we were God's enemies we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Jesus wasn't left hanging on that cross. He died, but he wasn't left in death. On that first glorious Easter Sunday, he was raised from death to life. And so Paul is surely saying this, that if when we were enemies, God reconciled to us and wants us to reconcile with him, and did that through the death of Christ, well, how much more now that Jesus is forever alive, he's not going back into death. How much more then do we remain reconciled to God and in the centre of his love and his care. Not only is this so, says Paul, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. So this is something that we're supposed to experience, and something that we're given as a gift, this reconciliation, and the implication is that we're supposed to be passing it on. Well, there we are. What about you and me today? Maybe today you can take a few moments just to reflect on what God has done for us in Jesus on the cross. Maybe there's someone that you need to reconcile with today. Perhaps you need to take the first step, a phone call or an email, a letter, a Skype, just to say, I'm sorry about what happened and I want us to be together again. It's not always possible, and it's certainly never easy, but it's what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. It's Friday. Good Friday. God bless you.